Throughout Walt Disney's history, we find these key moments where if the stars hadn't aligned and everything hadn't come together, there would be no Disney. And really what saved him is that cute little elephant with those big flappy ears that can fly.
At the time that Dumbo was made, the Disney studio was in financial trouble. Amazingly enough, Pinocchio and Fantasia did not succeed at the box office when they were first released.
They had to do a shorter, smaller, smarter picture, and that was Dumbo.
The economy of storytelling in that film is just so well done. I mean, it's a film that anybody studying animation storytelling should look at. I think even live-action filmmaking.
Everybody working on it was such a great pro, and by being that strong in all of their choices, in their layout choices, in their design choices, in their animation choices, it makes what you could conceive as a very small film very, very powerful.
They weren't armed like the crew of Pinocchio with the budget. They had a job to do. They had to get this out. The movie is sort of the metaphor for that attitude, and it's sort of perfectly fitting for what the movie was and how it was made.
Back in what they call Disney's golden age, in the late 30s, early 1940s, the 5 films that were produced then, Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi, they were all very different from one another, and they all had great merit as particular stories.
I think with those 5 movies, they were inventing the form of feature animation and kind of the form that would carry on through the rest of the century. People studying animation would definitely look to as the pinnacle of what animation could be, and maybe even the possibilities that animation could have.
It was monumental. I mean, Snow White, the first full-length animated feature done at Disney, it speaks for itself. I always look at the jumps in film history, and if you look at Steamboat Willie, 28, to Snow White, 37, think of how short of amount of time that is, and look at the difference in those films. To me, it represents the greatest leap in cinema history, and it blows my mind the light year that they went in just, that decade.
In Pinocchio, it is about the sheer level of perfection and craftsmanship. There is so much going on in the perfection of the lighting, the drawing on the characters, the beautiful realization of lots and lots of detail, but without actually minimizing the strength of the characters and the strength of the story.
And then you see Fantasia, and Fantasia is truly taking animation to another dimension where it's really trying to go, this is fine art, we're really pushing the boundaries here, we're really gonna see where it breaks. And Bambi, they're trying to explore, real movement. Can we capture how animals will move? Can we really sell this in animation? Each one seems like they were trying to go, all right, now where can we take the animation medium? And then there's Dumbo.
There are great things in all the classic Disney movies, things to aspire to, things that we feel they'll never be done any better than this. And Dumbo is one of those films that might even be a notch above those. And I think it's largely because, without doubt, people feel it is the most emotional film that the studio ever made. It is the one that really grabs your heart.
I think Dumbo is a perfect movie. It's just as seamless in terms of the way the story is told, but it also has great character animation. And I think ultimately it has a real emotional punch and a resonance that stays with you, stays with audiences.
The story of the misfit who gets kicked around and not treated well, everybody identifies with that. That's the reason that this film, above the others, really is very, very special, because it connects with people here.
The book was written in 1938 by Helen Aberson and Harold Pearl. It was the only published children's book that the couple ever did. They sold the story to a company called Rollabook, where the book would be on a scroll and you'd read through it. I don't think there are any copies of it that exist anymore. There was about 16 illustrations that were done by a local Syracuse artist, and those still exist. They're up in a collection up in Syracuse. So Disney locked up the rights and then gave the project to 2 of his top writers, and that was Joe Grant and Dick Huemer.
Joe Grant was one of the few people that Walt really trusted with a story.
After Walt, he was probably one of the most influential figures in the studio because of the impact he would have both on the story and on the design of the characters.
He had done caricatures for the LA Record in the 1920s, was discovered there by Disney, brought into the studio in 1933 to work on a short called Mickey's Gala Premiere, which was about Mickey having a Hollywood premiere and all the Hollywood stars come. Joe Grant did all the caricatures for that. Walt Disney recognized his brilliance as a creator, and so he brought him in to design characters for the Silly Symphonies and other Mickey Mouse shorts.
So Walt had Joe set up what they called the character model department to help set the looks of the characters. So early model sheets for Snow White and Pinocchio would very often have an OK JG, OK Joe Grant. But actually, it developed more into a think tank in terms of developing the personalities of the characters, as well as the kinds of stories that could be told in animation.
It was where a lot of the ideas for future films came from, including things like Lady and the Tramp, etc., etc.
And then he left the studio at the end of the 40s and came back at the studio in the 90s. And his influence in the 90s was very strong. I mean, he's the one who gave the idea for some of the characters in Pocahontas. He gave a lot of story ideas and gag ideas for quite a few of the movies of the new golden age of Disney animation.
Joe lived to be almost 100 years old. He was 96 when he died. And if you think about it, there are very few people who've lived almost the entire 20th century. Joe was one of them.
He died the day after he had been to work, and he loved everything he did. He loved working on Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, Pocahontas. It never stopped.
Dick Huemer was a very early veteran animator in New York, and he worked in one of the first animation studios, the Raoul Barre studio up in the Bronx. And eventually he went out to California and was sought after by Walt Disney because he was considered one of the finest animators on the East Coast. He eventually went with Disney, worked on a whole number of Silly Symphonies, and then was paired with Joe Grant on Fantasia.
My father was probably put on Fantasia because of his interest in classical music. In fact, my father was sometimes introduced by Walt as, "Meet Dick Huemer. He goes to operas."
They both came from New York, and so they had a lot in common. And I think their personalities were quite a bit alike, too. They could depend on each other. One would shoot an idea, and the other would shoot back. And that's how this all was done.
In January of 1940, Walt asked Joe Grant and Dick Huemer to start developing this story of this little elephant with the big ears.
The story was very sketchy in the original version, and what they did was they made a whole bunch of additions and changes to it. It was a little red robin that was the friend of Dumbo in the original story, and they changed that into a mouse, which is a great idea because elephants are supposed to be afraid of mice. So